1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 ცოტა მოგვიანებით მოვა 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 მოდის
interesting place, you know. It is saved. We made special arrangements for that. But welcome to Rondeli Foundation. Thank you for joining us in this rainy weather to the event co-organized by GFSIS and Atlantic Council of Georgia, our good friends and partners organization. And I know that it has been really busy last 2 days in our country. The Tbilisi strategic discussions took place in the presidential administration yesterday and 2 days ago. And you know, many of us had the pleasure to be part of that discussion, thought-provocative, insightful, on the security issues facing the country, the region, and the world. And today's event, the topic of today's event is somehow echoing of what we were discussing yesterday or day before yesterday. And one of the former high-ranking official yesterday, whom I won't quote as yesterday, it was a Chatham House, mentioned that 2017 marks the 70th anniversary of one of these the most successful initiative reconstruction efforts in the human history and the Marshal Plan, and that we all need to reflect and assess where do we stand. And historical circumstances are different and differ, regional specifics as well, countries need different approaches, but we thought that experience of the Marshal Plan and its success still matters for the countries of Eastern Europe and its Western allies, and especially the solidarity associated with this initiative. And NATO actually came up with this idea. I won't say that it was mine. But we have been discussing about this necessity of doing this thing for a wider public. And we've started, at least if not in January, in March, this discussion. But I'm glad that by mid-December we've managed to organize the discussion with the help of our distinguished speakers. I did not anticipate that we would have had such a high level presenters. Special thanks to Carpenter, Brian Whitmore, and Benjamin Fricke for agreeing to find the time in their busy schedule, and after those discussions especially, and find time to be with us today. Thank you to NATO as well for cooperation, and with this I won't take long and give floor to Shota Utiashvili, Senior Research Fellow at GFSIS, who will moderate the event. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Eka, very much. Thanks to the audience for coming on this rainy day. Special thanks to our speakers. I won't take much time because we have a very interesting presentations ahead, but let me just say a very few words about the speakers. Mike Carpenter. I've known Mike for years because he served in the US Embassy in Tbilisi, working mostly on the conflict-related issues. Then he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense under Obama administration, and now he is working in the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy under the former Vice President Joe Biden. And if you have seen their most recent article in Foreign Affairs about how to counter the Russian influence, I think it was excellent. So I'm looking forward to hear his thoughts. Brian Whitmore from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. The Power Vertical, the blog that he leads, is I think one of the most interesting and entertaining in this radio. And he's been working on this part of the world on I don't even know how many decades, but he's certainly but certainly a very interesting speaker to listen to. And Mr. Benjamin Fricke, who is a Scientific Associate, Regional Program Political Dialogue South Caucasus, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. And Benjamin will provide European perspective. And so we try to combine European and American, because sometimes on this conference in Tbilisi you hear only Americans or only Europeans. So we decided that it would be better to listen to to the both sides of the Atlantic. So without further ado, let us start, and let me give floor to Mike Carpenter.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. You know, I thought about this topic as I was reflecting on how I would broach this conversation. And, you know, as an American, I think it's actually a very pertinent anniversary given where we find ourselves in terms of foreign policy ideology in Washington right now, which is, I think, unprecedented. And we were talking about this a little bit earlier, and I'm gonna be brief here at the opening, so I'm not rambling too long with introductory comments. But I will try and encapsulate this this strange dichotomy that we currently have in foreign policy ideology, which, as I said, I think is unprecedented for the post-war era in the United States. And the linkage to the Marshall Plan is that the Marshall Plan is the embodiment in U.S. foreign policy of this concept of enlightened self-interest, that the United States will pursue policies outside of its borders which are not conducted for altruistic reasons at all. They are conducted for self-interested reasons, but which have a context and a scope to them which is broader than simply the United States and what benefits us in the immediate term. And so the Marshall Plan, obviously the investment of so much money in the reconstruction of Europe, was fundamentally in the interest of the United States, and that's been borne out because it created greater markets for U.S. products. It ushered in an era of unprecedented prosperity and security in Europe. But at the time, it was a very risky, challenging, and not necessarily now, when we look back, it was successful, but not necessarily at the time, guaranteed to be a successful undertaking. And so it took a lot of political courage to be able to launch this sort of initiative. But this was a time when the United States set about to fashion what we now call, as a shorthand, the liberal international order. So the institutions that were created after the Second World War, to include the financial institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Bretton Woods system, but then also, based on the UN Charter, the principles of human rights and democracy, which we helped to sustain and spread around the world in the many decades since then. And then also the sort of the more fundamental principles of international relations like sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-use of force, etc. This ideology, which is held through Democratic and Republican administrations alike, is now being challenged by President Trump. And for those who don't think that President Trump has an ideology, I would ask you to go back and read all of his speeches on foreign policy, all of his articles, everything he said, going back decades, and you will find there is consistency there. The man does not make things up as he goes along, contrary to what some would have you believe. There is a consistency there, and the consistency is this: he does not believe in the value in the United States standing up for international institutions. He believes America First is a very, very narrow, unenlightened vision of America's interests. It is one where global trade, setting the patterns of global trade, is seen as superfluous. Therefore, we have withdrawn from from TTIP and from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which were, in my mind, two of the greatest strategic decisions of the Obama administration, and which would have forced China and so many other countries around the world to follow our lead, because we would have set the global norms of trade. Instead, we're now in a world of every country decides for itself, and the United States does not lead, it follows. In terms of security institutions as well, it is not by accident that candidate Trump disparaged NATO as being obsolete. He doesn't believe in the value of NATO. He has been forced politically now to pay lip service to NATO. He does not believe in NATO. He does not believe in the European Union. He has actually been much more consistent on the European Union, but these are two sides of the same coin. The first foreign leader that President Trump entertained in Washington after the inauguration was Nigel Farage, because he shares a deep and abiding interest with Farage, a disdain for supranational institutions. Trump believes nations should go it alone. This is an ideological belief. It is not a pragmatic belief that he has adopted as he has gone along. He has been pushed away from that belief by some of his advisors who are much more traditional in their understanding of foreign policy, such as the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and a few others. But this is his ideology, and he has people that he has surrounded himself in the West Wing of the White House who share this ideology. Some of them are gone, like Steve Bannon, but others, like Steve Miller, are still around. And so do not take this lightly, because this is a fundamental shift in how America interacts with the world. And it bodes for an era of greater transactionalism, and it also bodes for an era where the United States is withdrawn from some of these efforts. The Marshall Plan is, of course, a very grandiose effort. Nobody was talking about instituting something like that in the near future. But much smaller efforts to instill cooperation in the European space or in the South Caucasus are now imperiled by this new ideology. Now, I'm going to close on this because, as I said at the outset, I'm not going to ramble on for too long in the beginning. I want to make this dynamic. But Trump has been checked, as I said, by some of these traditional establishment national security figures who hold very different views from his own. H.R. McMaster, who reports directly to Trump and who has no constitutional power outside of his relationship to Trump, has a very different set of beliefs from the president. He believes in internationalism. He believes in the U.S. leading the international order, establishing norms and principles such as sovereignty and territorial integrity, which, by the way, means investing in places like Georgia to ensure that Russian revanchism is checked, or if not checked, at least that there are costs and consequences imposed for Russia's actions. Someone like McMaster believes that deeply. Jim Mattis, who I'm privileged to know, believes in the same things. I know because I've had these conversations with him. But we're in a really uncharted waters in the sense that these gentlemen, who are honorable men and who I think have a vision that is not too far from Democrats and Republicans for decades alike, are fundamentally at odds with the ideological principles of their boss, who's the president now of the United States. So I will stop there, and then we can take up more of this in discussion.
Thank you. It's always difficult to speak after Mike because we think so much alike that he always says the things I wanted to say. But I'll be brief, and I'll try to say pretty much the same things Mike just said, but I'll say them a little differently. The Marshall Plan should not be viewed in isolation. It should be seen in the context of a lot of other things that were happening in 1947 and throughout the late 40s, the creation of the Bretton Woods system, the establishment of NATO, the U.S. National Security Act of 1947, and so on. And the Marshall Plan represented a choice and an investment in the future. This was a conscious choice by the United States that it was going to shape the international world order for the better. For the better. It was going to cost us money in the short run, but this was not a transactional effort. This was an investment and a conscious choice. It represented something that the United States leadership understood in 1947, that having the responsibility of a global hegemon incurs costs. And for the recipient countries, it implied a temporary and limited sacrifice of sovereignty. I mean, this is something I think we always forget when we talk about the Marshall Plan. But these funds were distributed down to the local level by U.S. military officials. It incurred, and I think if we're going to talk about the Marshall Plan in the context of this part of the world, and I've had this conversation with Ukrainians and with Georgians, would people be willing to sacrifice sovereignty for such an investment from whether it be the United States, the European, or the Union, or the West in general? I don't know the answer to that question, and I obviously cannot answer that question. And I agree with Mike. I don't think we're thinking about something along the lines of the scale of the Marshall Plan in the near future. But this is, if we're talking about something like this, this is something that I think potential recipient countries have to bear in mind. This implied a huge sacrifice, temporary, of sovereignty. And sacrificing sovereignty is something that doesn't really go down well in this part of the world for obvious historical reasons that should require little elaboration. Now, that said, I mean, there are some similarities between now and 1947. Then, as now, the international system was in flux and up for grabs. There is no guarantee that the world we saw post-47 was going to be the world that we got. We could have got a very, very, very different world if different decisions were made. Then, as now, liberalism was under assault. It had just fought back against it, the worst assault against it to date from, I guess, inside the family, if you will, speaking of Nazi Germany. And it was facing off now against its most formidable foe outside the family, Soviet communism. So we have some similarities there as well. Then, as now, the world was in what I would call primarily a war of governance. A war of governance of two governing models. Then it was called the Cold War, and we were talking about a war of governance between Western liberalism and Soviet communism. Now, and I guess reasonable people can differ as to whether what we're in now is or is not a new Cold War. I'm kind of agnostic on that question. I think this is a question of semantics and terminology. But what I do know we are in right now very clearly is a very important war of governance between two normative systems that are facing off against each other on the Eurasian landmass. The one to the west that, of course, is we know by all the things we hold near and dear, the rights of the individual, the rule of law, the sanctity of contracts, the subordination of power to the law, and one to the east that's based on an entirely different set of principles: patron-client relationships, cronyism, corruption, kleptocracy. And it's interesting when you look at the difference between these two wars of governance, because communism, for all its faults, and I don't have to tell the people in this room those faults were legion, it did appeal to a higher aspiration in human nature in its ideal form. And corruption appeals to something that's just as powerful, but it's much more base. It's human greed, right? Which of these is more powerful? I guess we're going to see pretty soon. Then as now, there was a country, a divided country, that was on the front lines of this, the Federal Republic of Germany. And now there are two divided countries, possibly three if you include Moldova, but I would certainly include Georgia and Ukraine as being the frontline countries in this war of governance. And I've said before, and I'll say here, I view the fates of these two countries as no less important than the fate of West Germany was in 1947, right? These are not faraway small countries of which we know little. Your security and ours are inexorably linked. And the more people in Washington and Brussels begin to realize that, the better. I mean, I'm fond of saying we are all Georgians, we are all Ukrainians, and I believe that. Now, there's also a lot of ways that we're different now, and I think Mike very articulately spelled them out, but I'll just basically briefly say, then there was leadership in the West that understood enlightened self-interest. And they did not view the world in a transactional way. It did not view NATO as a country club in which everybody has to pay dues, and if you fall behind on your dues, you get kicked out of the country club. So can we get our leadership to the point that it understands the importance of this moment? And I think this is something that events like this, think tanks like yours, people like us that speak publicly about this are trying to nudge. And I think I hope our discussion today pushes that a little bit farther, and I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much. Now it's even more difficult for me to say anything, but since you provided somewhat of a US perspective, there's basically a misconception, I would just to clarify, in the case of Germany. When you look at post-World War II pictures of Germany, you see maybe the city center of Cologne, Dresden, or Berlin, and it looks like a country that was completely put to ashes and it's just a pile of rubble. Well, a lot of investments happened during the war and before the war, and Germany only received factually 11% of the Marshall Plan aid. About $1 billion back then was given away in loans, which had to be paid back, and the rest was grants. The Marshall Plan has about a size of today's money, $140 billion, which, if you look at what alone the Euro rescue costs today, is not a lot of money. So what you really need to understand is there was a post-war boom, of course, but the United States at that point was about 70% of the global economy. You couldn't repeat such a type of Marshall Plan today because you had a system that was very similar in values, that was very similar in connectivity, and very similar in structure. And only 11% were given to Germany, but Germany rose the quickest out of the Depression. But you also have to understand the Big Bang, so to speak, for the Federal Republic of Germany, which happened about in 1950, was also because machine and steel export skyrocketed because of the war in Korea. So it was a US economy in need, plus some kickstart money, which was partially paid back by Germany eventually, but also built on a functioning economy. Germany has always been a very densely populated country with a decentralized economic structure. So if you look at what happened in Italy, in Britain, and in France, they got more, but they still didn't rise as quickly as Germany, and there was a fundamental base for this. Just one fun fact, actually, the Marshall Plan aid was paid back relatively quickly in 1971, but Germany didn't pay off its debt from the Versailles Treaty until 2010. So the main difference also between post-World War II and post-World War I Europe is that there was a debt forgiveness. And I think if we build onto Europe today, and considering all the challenges that the two speakers before me already pointed out, was that we have a euro crisis, we have a debt crisis, and we have an international credit crisis because we just have too much credit in the wrong places. And we have not managed to implement debt forgiveness for a country like Greece and actually been able to help their economies to substantially recover. As a matter of fact, the German government has always been supporting, and the Adenauer Foundation does too, European integration and closer cooperation. But just 2 days ago, the ECB actually released a study that, yes, the euro wasn't actually very beneficial for a lot of countries because it is a currency that can depreciate and appreciate according to the needs and desires of the individual country. So you need structures in place that do certain redistributions, and in my opinion, that includes also a debt cut for a lot of these southern European countries. Because what the Marshall Plan fundamentally did was it established a system of what Mr. Carpenter mentioned, a liberal democracy, a liberal economy, and that set of values actually broke down those barriers we had of protectionism and enabled organizations like NATO, like the EU, and potentially a TTIP in the future at some point to continue to grow. But that is a set of values that we need to understand. we also need to rethink the policies we're doing today. And as a matter of fact, that will be the only way we can protect that open, free, and liberal democracy approach we had in the past. And another thing that I would like to point out, because I think this is what we see as a challenge of the 21st century, is of course a refugee crisis. The European Union is a very open market in itself, but it certainly has its protection mechanisms to the outside. And we do have a reason why there are so many Africans, so many people from the Middle East coming. Of course, it is based on war to some extent, especially in the Middle East, but it is also based on economic deficiencies in these countries. We need to break out as European economies, and most likely it would be the best to unite in this endeavor, but to integrate also the North African countries, especially. If you just look at Roman history, those were traditionally and historically part of an economic structure that could be revamped to some extent. And we had other attempts to unite Southern Europe economically with the Latin Monetary Union, or we had the Hanseatic League, which is one of my favorite setups for an economic system, because it was built on mutual defense and economic trade, but it left certain degree of self-determination for these countries that were willing to cooperate freely with each other. But another thing you need to consider is we talk always about external EU migration. Actually, the biggest migration wave happens within the European Union, especially from southern European countries after the crisis. So how do you get to develop these southern European countries again in a way that we, first of all, secure the cultures of Greece, Spain, and Italy? How do we get rid of the debt crisis that we have at so many banks and so many state governments? And how do we develop these economies properly again? And as I said, I don't think we can actually repeat the Marshall Plan as we did it back then, but we have to rethink the Marshall Plan. Because you were also mentioning that we have those dividing lines again, especially between Putinism that's trying to abuse things and our Western liberal economies. Actually, in one of the first post-war elections in Italy, we had the CIA giving a lot of money, of course, to Christian Democrats, and it was the only time I think one party in the Italian government had a supermajority. And they actually had trucks with projectors going through Italian villages, showing movies and, let's say, some kind of persuasive films to show people what happens in countries like Czechoslovakia when the communists actually take over power. It was a warning to those people: if you vote communists, then you will probably end up at the same thing. And we have that propaganda war going on again. Just look at the play. We had the so-called Deputy, which was about Pius XII, who was then, through a KGB operation, brandmarked as Hitler's Pope, which of course was a smear campaign, because he was very scared of the communists in Italy, because he knew what the communists did in Czechoslovakia and in Poland. So we have a lot of comparison here, and it was people like Winston Churchill already, when he gave his Fulton speech, or his Iron Curtain speech in 1946, that Truman eventually got to the point where he had to persuade almost isolationist Congress to actually provide that money. And a lot of these dollars came back to the United States, because Volkswagen, for instance, used assembly lines from the United States. This is why Volkswagen became so powerful and such a important company again in a European context, which of course, you mentioned it too, the United States economy benefited from as well. So this was a set of values that was implemented. It was a recognition of the challenges on the global and international system, and of course it was a containment policy. And we have to apply that set of values once more today in order to overcome our challenges, because just copy and paste in this this world today, it doesn't work, and we have to understand our situation in order to overcome the challenges we have today and recover especially the European and North African economies, because that will be our challenge. If we don't do this, Europe will have a much, much worse refugee problem in the future, and hardly any economic talk will help in this case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Well, we heard the European and American perspective and the issues and the problems that the US and the EU face. You know, US after the change of the administration, the problems that EU faces, the migrant crisis, this rise of wave of populism, financial, economic aftermaths of the crisis. Now let's hear the Georgian perspective on that, how Georgia views what sort of transatlantic solidarity it needs from its partners to advance on the path to democratization, economic progress, and integration into Western economic and security alliances. It's my pleasure to give the floor to Mr. David Sikharulidze, and I won't really waste your time introducing him. You all know him very well. Please, Dato.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Shota. Let me congratulate GFSIS with the renovated hall room or the classroom. So they went green partially. So that's good in our polluted city. Okay. Well, the Shota put a word discussant next to my name. I don't know what the hell it means, but if I have to challenge other speakers, I'm not going to challenge them because I agree. Basically, what I'd like to say today is that I think Brian spoke about it already. The importance of creation of the new Europe was in the holistic approach. So when we are talking about the Marshall Plan, we should not forget that there was a Marshall Plan was coupled with, not coupled, but there was the three major pillars that guaranteed long-term security, stability, development, economic prosperity for entire Europe. And I think that it basically created the solid foundation for what we call today European Union or Europe. Or those three pillars were, first of all, the Marshall Plan. Well, let's start from the basics. First of all, NATO. The security comes first, and then this, well, I think that was not heard before. That was the alliance based not on the strategic, not only on the strategic interest, but also the alliance that was based on shared values. Second component, the Marshall Plan, that was designed to rebuild Europe and to generate economic development. And the third was democracy. So these three major pillars did the trick. That was that what we call today the well, prosperous and peaceful and stable Europe. And then I think that these years, even though these countries were challenged by the power which was not less brutal than Nazism, the communism, they survived and they prospered, and then they ultimately won. And I think that, those who know me, they know that I'm a big fan of President Truman, because I think this was the practically or the conceptually new vision for the to guarantee peace, stability, and security in post-war period. Of course, there are no direct analogies in the different times of the history, but I think that basically this main approach to base security, stability, and development on these three pillars that paid off already, if we look at Europe, has no alternative. And it was long-term vision, and it was vision that only the serious leader could push forward, and then it was not an easy decision. It was practically, I cannot imagine how much courage would it take to go to Congress and ask them to, allocate money from US taxpayers to help not only those countries that were US allies, but also that were US adversaries just a few years ago. And then it takes a lot of political courage. I think that NATO, the creation of NATO was also, that Article 5 in particular, that I mean, sometimes when we are having discussions today about the Georgia's NATO accession or the Georgia's future, we are facing the issues that I assume, and then as well, history proves that some of our European and then US administration was facing at that time. Why would Article 5 make US more secure? Why is, I don't know, the West Berlin defendable? Was West Berlin defendable at that time? Then we often hear when we are talking about the Georgia's NATO accession that whether Georgia is defendable or not, or are we ready to defend? So I think that there are some parallels and then some arguments that were used at that time just to counter the skeptics, both economic and military arguments at that time. And then what matters after all that is a principle and perseverance to pursuing the line that ultimately paid back. Talking about the situation, seriousness of the situation, I think that 1947 was much more dangerous time than we are facing now. There was the huge adversary with the huge military power and already very close to invent the bomb, and with also strong ideological power. Even though we know that the communists killed much more people than any other ideology in the world, at that time was not that clear, and then communist ideas were used, wastely used, to let's say spread disinformation and then mount the propaganda campaigns. So I think that all this approach has been something that benefited a lot. At that time, Georgia, because of its location, has been left on the other side of the Iron Curtain. But the containment guaranteed that the security, stability, and prosperity of the western part of the Europe. The second, well, the pushback, or they called it the rollback, happened during 80s when, and 80s are interesting because the principle of so-called the strategy to win in the Cold War was also based on these three principles. The military strengths, which is always important, the economic prosperity. I remember the funny story when Hoover, who was one of the founding fathers of the FBI, was asked that if he had the chance to give, send one book, you know, there are many books banned in Soviet Union, what would it be? He was asked by journalists. Everyone was expecting answer, either the Bible or, I don't know, Solzhenitsyn's book. He said Sears catalog, the Superstore's catalog. That also play, and then I think it was right, because Sears is the big department store in the United States that sells everything. And also the third component, the democracy and then freedom, also played important role in bringing down Berlin Wall and then giving freedom to many other nations that were living beyond the Iron Curtain. So I think that we called the panel the vision still relevant. I think vision is still relevant. It needs a much more structured approach and much more clear and then concise strategy that combines all these three components: to promote democracy, first of all, to promote security. So the alliance that proved to be perhaps the most effective international arrangement since ever, I think, and through economic development. So I think that, yeah, even though there are no direct parallels in the history, I think that the vision, approach, and the concept of, let's say, putting freedom on offensive is still relevant. And then I think that there are practically no alternatives to it.
Thank you to all the speakers, and now we're open for questions, and we'll collect a few questions and then have panelists answer them. Please name yourself and name the person you're addressing to. Mamuka and then Georgi, and then Tom.
Thank you. Mamuka Kudava, Free University, where I'm teaching the same subjects, by the way, and not in very details, but that's why it's so important for me to listen to you as well. Two questions to everyone who wants to respond. First, as you mentioned, of course, this Marshall Plan was only one part of bigger Truman Doctrine, right, which is which was elaborated in 47, 48, based on a long telegram, right? Many parts of it were taken by Truman and his staff. But let's not forget that at the same time there was even harsher approach offered by Churchill. And Truman Doctrine was not very proactive, but more neutral type of policy. Churchill was advocating even bigger push towards Soviet Union because he was thinking that the West is in the best condition now to roll back on Soviet Union, and which was not taken by Truman. So how you view that? Let's see if let's imagine that this position would won. Probably there is some idea that 40 years would not be enough. No, it would be too long for the West to beat Soviet Union. So just theoretical question. Second, when our German colleague rightly mentioned that there is no parallels with the Marshall Plan, everyone would want in Ukraine or Georgia to have some type of mini Marshall Plan, but what we're talking about here is definitely very contrary to what Brian said. There is no way that there is no political will in Europe to even consider this kind of approach. So that would be, to be realistic, it won't happen. So we should not count on that. We should be realistic. It hasn't happened even in the 90s when it was the most kind of would have been great policy on the part of the West. So what we should do more to enlighten those decision makers, not to think about some new Marshall Plan, but in what directions we can get more support in political, economic, military, etc., where you see realistic ways to support this country so that Marshall Plan peace which can be called Marshall Plan peace in this region. And let's face it, after World War II, there was political will. Now there is no urgency on that, right? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Georgi Badridze of the Rondeli Foundation. Like Mamuka, I'm also a career diplomat, and I also teach political systems and for international relations. And the latest essay that my students wrote was the reasons of Germany's success after the World War II. And of course, everyone mentioned the Marshall Plan, but what they also said that without German political system, the governance which you mentioned was so important. Marshall Plan alone, of which Germany benefited less than others, by the way, without the combination of Marshall Plan and the German political system that, well, I told them that it is kind of built like Mercedes 600, der Grosser, right? This would not have happened. And Mamuka already has mentioned that yes, kind of just good wishes for the neighborhood is not enough. We are all appreciative of the Eastern Partnership, and this would be a question to you, Benjamin Fricke. Only good wishes would not make huge difference in terms of this Eastern Partnership. There is a huge difference of what the European Union and Russia wants its neighborhood to be. Europeans clearly want the neighborhood to be stable, economically prosperous and democratic. And Russia wants exact opposite of this. And I'm not sure who does more effort to achieve this goal. So I really wonder if we take aside the current internal problems that European Union is currently facing and European nations individually, whether there will eventually be the understanding that it is not just Russia's neighborhood, one, and second, that it requires, if not new Marshal Plan, but greater effort, and that the outcome would benefit, like Americans understood that in the 40s, that the outcome would benefit Europeans not less, maybe even more than the beneficiaries. And just to echo what David said about Herbert Hoover, he probably was a prophet, because I remember very clearly when the first, not even real perestroika, glasnost was allowed in Soviet Union. There was a comedy program on Moscow television called Vakruk Smecha. And I remember distinctly, maybe it was 86 or something like that, a comedian on the stage reading a poem. And it's a list of curses, clearly directed at the Soviet government, but implicitly, not directly. And so it goes a very long way. I want you to do this. За то, что я увидел в журнале Neckermann. For everything I saw in the Neckermann catalog. It was actually not serious, but German.
Tamar Kinturashvili, Media Development Foundation. My question is how you see future of Russian occupied territories in the so-called new Marshal Plan, since most powerful message pro-Russian political parties disseminate in Georgia is that in case of integration of Georgia into NATO, we will lose our Russian occupied territories, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and Article 5 does not allow NATO to receive us with these territories. Thank you.
One more question, and then I'll ask the speakers to respond.
Hi, David Batashvili, Seoul, Georgia. I have a question to Michael Carpenter. You spoke about this challenge that has arisen within the United States to the modern international order, to the liberal international order. And I think this challenge should be surprising, at least for a couple of reasons. One, because America has created actually this international order. So, I mean, if you are an American nationalist, it's kind of ironic that you go against the international order that enables the United States to be the preeminent power in the world and that America has created, basically. And the second reason is that America already has experience with isolationism from the 20s and 30s, and that experience is not very good. Things did not end well. Back there, when America tried to distance itself from some of the main currents in the international politics at the time. And nevertheless, here we are. This is a strong current in the American politics, and the American president himself belongs to it. So my question to you is, in your opinion, what are the fundamental reasons behind the existence and the present strengths of this this trend in the American politics? Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to try and answer these questions by sort of weaving together a narrative. I don't know if I'm actually going to answer any of them, but I'll try. I'll start by saying that the situation after World War II was fundamentally different than the situation is today. And I very much subscribe to the great book by Ralph Dahrendorf about post-war Germany, Society and Democracy in Germany. We have to remember that as a result of the Second World War, there was a fundamental, what he called Gleichschaltung, of all traditional institutions in Germany. I mean, German society was wiped out. It was wiped out first by Hitler, and then the United States came in together with the other occupying powers, the UK and France, and we basically ruled Germany for a while. It wasn't that Germans pulled themselves up from, I mean, with all due respect, by their bootstraps and created Volkswagen from scratch on their own. And the Americans, you know, we left in May of '45 and left the Germans to their own devices. This was a meticulous, years-long effort to nation build from scratch. It required an enormous investment of resources, and it was preceded by the type of social dislocation when you go back to the theorists of democracy, Barrington Moore and others, Karl Polanyi, that was unprecedented. And we had a similar situation in Japan, where the United States was also the occupying power, and for better or for worse, we essentially imposed on Japan a model of governance and of economic organization as well. And so there is no analogy today. And so I think that, you know, you can talk about Marshal Plan and forget about all these other sociological conditions which were vital. It was all based on that. It was not based on money. The money was, you know, that was peripheral to everything else that went on in terms of rebuilding Europe. It helped, but it was not vital. So we're in a different situation today. And today, to get to your question, I think, you know, well, let me back up a little bit. Contrary to traditional realist thinking in international relations, the Ken Waltz school, Morgenthau, Steve Krasner, etc., argues that in the absence of world government, states follow their own interests and there's balance of power. We have seen, and the failed League of Nations after World War I and all of this, we have actually seen a type of community emerge in the international system that is unprecedented, in the sense that there have been no wars among states, that there has been incredible prosperity, and not just the survival, but mutual cooperation to ensure democratic standards. And that subset of the international system where that has occurred is called the transatlantic community. And this is not recognized by international relations scholars to the degree that it has happened. This is a unique type of, not world government, but of collaborative endeavors within a subset of the international community that is unprecedented in history. However, today, that transatlantic community is being frayed. And it is being frayed by a number of different forces. And I'm going to identify 6, and I think most of these apply to Europe, some apply to the United States as well. The first is the threat from the East. Obviously, Russian meddling, subversive measures, revanchist policies, Ukraine, Georgia. The second is the threat from the South. It's the threat of extremism, of terrorism, the associated migration that occurs in states that are embroiled in extremist conflicts like Syria, and then in turn, some of the consequences of that migration and those actions, and I'll get to that in a second. The third is economic dislocation. Not just the internal challenges within the Eurozone, which led to almost to Grexit and could still lead to Grexit. I agree, if there's not a debt relief that is not just simply reallocating the debt into a future time, but also things associated with automation, digitization, the change in the global economy that are causing internal contradictions and a real crisis, especially following 2008, 2009. Fourth, the challenge of energy in Europe, which allows, again, and by the way, all of these challenges that I'm talking about, they're all interrelated. They all feed on each other. They're mutually reinforcing. So the fourth is energy security, the lack thereof, and Russia's ability to use energy to divide European states amongst each other. The fourth is institutional weakness within the EU. For example, the complete failure of Frontex to be able to defend the EU's borders when the migration crisis occurred in 2015. But that's just one example. There are so many other institutional weaknesses within European institutions, also within American institutions. Then finally, a sort of an ideological backlash against liberal democracy from nationalism and populism, and which is fed in turn by migration, which is stoked by Russia. Again, all of these threads are mutually reinforcing. And so they have frayed the solidarity within Europe. Grexit, almost the exit of Cyprus from the EU as well due to economic reasons. These are all fraying European solidarity, and we see it displayed in terms of now frictions emerging between Germany and Poland, between Ireland and the UK over Brexit, Catalonia, so on and so forth. We're facing some of the same challenges in the United States, which is why nationalism and populism are resurgent in our country. Also due to migration challenges, also due to the same digitization, automation of the economy, and so on and so forth. My point is not to give you a whole list of challenges that we face, although that's part of it, but to suggest that for each of these challenges, the threat from the East, the threat from the South, economy, energy, institutions, and ideologies, we overcome these crises only by making the transatlantic community stronger. That is the only way that we tackle these challenges, and right now we're not getting it. We're not addressing this. Germany, again, with all due respect, is pursuing Nord Stream 2. That is not a policy of solidarity. That is a policy of national egoism. I'm no longer a diplomat. I was never a good diplomat because I always spoke what was on my mind, okay? Maybe that's why I left. But you see that instead of forging a greater sense of transatlantic community and pursuing but Trump is also responsible for this. He's denigrating the EU. He's denigrating our allies. He insulted Chancellor Merkel when she came to Washington. So we are failing at tackling these fundamental challenges that we face, which could really rip apart the transatlantic community, not to sound too dire about it, but could if we don't reinvigorate the sense of transatlantic community that we had during much of the Cold War and that animated fundamentally the Marshall Plan, but also all the other institutions that emerged after World War II.
There's nothing I love more than seeing Mike Carpenter unplugged. I love it when our great diplomats leave government service. I'm always sad, but I also it's a real treat to watch them being able to speak their minds in public. I'm also going to pick up on one of the questions and build a small narrative around it. I want to take off on your question about the Truman Doctrine. You're correct. The Truman Doctrine, compared to what Churchill was advocating, was actually very soft, but it was very hard compared to the other side of the debate, because you had a debate in the U.S. foreign policy community between what became known as the Yalta axioms, and I don't think I have to explain what those are, and the Riga axioms, which was around George Kennan and the diplomats who were in the U.S. representative office in Riga before before the recognition of the Soviet Union. So in many sense, the Truman Doctrine, which did to a degree represent the triumph of the Riga axioms over the Yalta axioms, was, if you bring the Churchill point into it, it was a compromise between the two, containment and not rollback, but certainly not allowing Russia a sphere of influence, which is what the Yalta axioms were advocating. Around that was built a political consensus, right? And you had a strong political consensus in the United States that lasted until the Vietnam War, effectively, when it came apart. But that consensus was not just about foreign affairs. It was not just about the need to contain the Soviet Union. I think this is a point that doesn't get made enough, and I'm going to make it here. There was a consensus not just around containment, but around the social welfare state. It's funny when you put these issues in the context of American politics. The left does not. My friends on the left do not like to admit the containment worked. They'll say, what about Vietnam? What about Allende? What about this? What about... I give you that. I'll give you that. Despite all the mistakes and the bumps, it worked. It worked. The goal of containment was to keep Western Europe safe and free, and it worked. But it wouldn't have worked if you didn't have the other piece. and this is where the right takes issue with my views, the welfare state saved capitalism. The welfare state was not socialism light. The welfare state was a rescue mission for capitalism, because then, like now, you had large parts of our population who were disenfranchised, then by industrialization, now by globalization, right? And the social welfare state in both Europe and the United States brought them in and made them stakeholders in our free liberal democracies. And it made it so it was not so easy for a hostile outside power, then the Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, to play on the inevitable divisions and resentments that result when you have disenfranchised populations. Now the trick today, because in an age of globalization, when capital can move where it is taxed the lowest and regulated the lowest, and therefore where you have less social protections, how to do that today is a very, very tough challenge. I'm not an economist, nor am I a sociologist, and I'm not even going to attempt to try, but I really like to think of the beginning of a conversation about this. And this leads me into the discussion of political leadership and political will, which does seem to be lacking right now. And I'm always asking myself the question, is this, because in democratic societies, our leaders are supposed to reflect the will of the people. Now, is this a problem of leadership, or is this a problem of us? Is this a problem of society? Could Winston Churchill himself rally the current UK around an internationalist policy? Could Harry Truman or Franklin Roosevelt rally the United States today? Could Konrad Adenauer himself rally Germany? Is the problem that we don't have the leaders, or is the problem that we as publics have gotten soft and complacent? And I, again, don't have an answer to that, but I think it's a question that is worth asking. I'd also want to address the issue of the occupied territories in Georgia and NATO. Mike, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I do not think there is anything in the NATO Charter, this is a convenient myth that seems to be out there, that forbids a country entering NATO if it has a territorial dispute. I think if I understand the language of the NATO Charter, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, that it means you have to be working toward resolving that issue, which I believe Georgia is certainly. And first of all, West Germany was a founding member of NATO, and it certainly had territorial issues. So I think this is a red herring, to be honest. And I think we have to stop repeating this, because Russia certainly thinks this is the case. And I think the Putin regime thinks this is the case because we keep repeating this. But I don't think there is anything in the NATO Charter that forbids. Anybody who knows more than I do, please feel free to correct me.
Well, Yes. Well, Mr. Carpenter, you don't have to apologize. I agree with a lot of what you said. Actually, the U.S. Army back then tasked a force of people looking at what industry was left, and actually the Marshal Plan is what I mentioned about Volkswagen. The Marshal Plan was Germany's Henry Ford moment, when the assembly lines were introduced into Germany, which meant a de facto modernization of the country. And also, I disagree, however, on one point. I don't think German society itself was really wiped out, because the civil code that Germany still obeys to today still came from the imperial times under Emperor William. And we still use it today to a large extent. We even still pay Emperor William's taxes today. We still pay tax on sparkling wine, which he introduced to finance his battle war ship fleet. So we still pay his ships pretty much. And the tax never got abolished even after the collapse of a few times. So there was a continuation in, let's say, the German history. Of course, society as it existed back then was gone, but the German tradition to some extent were continued. And what you mentioned about the territories, even until the 2+4 treaties, the agreement that eventually united Germany, technically Silesia, Eastern Pomerania, and Eastern Prussia, which were, of course, especially Eastern Prussia, Königsberg, integral part of the German Empire, were under Polish administration. The Poles still were afraid until 1990 that the Germans may return. So that wasn't really resolved until very recently. But to get back to your question, you ask about also what can be done, a new Marshall Plan. Germany is a very difficult case in many ways because we also have a lot of people who do believe that Russia is the partner to talk to. What you mentioned about Nord Stream 2, it is absolutely true. The acting foreign minister, Sigmar Gabriel, in Washington, D.C. yesterday said the United States is not a partner anymore and Germany should reconsider its foreign policy approach. I find that absolutely idiotic and dangerous. I'm sorry, this is really what it is. And Merkel and this large part of the CDU and me personally certainly have never supported this idea. And it was the Gerhard Schröder administration who implemented Nord Stream 1. Schröder now obviously works for Gazprom. Gabriel's probably waiting for a job in Russia. And we have an inherent Russian problem in Germany, and a lot of parts acknowledge that. But we are a democracy too, and those people do get elected to parliament. What we as a Konrad Adenauer Foundation do is actually point out these issues. After the Russians had, again, borderized some parts of Georgia in July, we did a huge event on this. We write back about it. And we do put our finger into that problem. We have advocated for the Eastern Partnership. We just hosted an event with a very nice outcome and communique about how to develop the Eastern Partnership further with the chair people of the Ukrainian, Moldovan, and Georgian parliaments. So we are trying to do our homework here and be practical. Yet, I mean, I'm not an elected member of parliament. I don't have any vote on this, and I don't know if anyone reads the stuff that I write back. But we do our very best to make that very clear, because we increasingly notice that we have a problem at home too. And Nord Stream 2 is just one small part of it. It has become a systemic problem by now. And we really need to be very cautious. In front of the German Bundestag, for instance, there is an organization with the Georgievsky flag, and they have the Russian flag too, and they say, you need to align with Putin because Germany until today is still occupied by US imperialists. They're financed by the Russian Veterans Organization. And another thing I want to point out is if you look at the Pegida protests that went on in Germany for a while, one of the only outlets that broadcasted it was called Rondeli TV. That was a Russian-financed outlet. And there is a problem that I see. A lot of the mainstream media ignored the Pegida protest for a long time after they made a huge hype of it. So people thought, well, if the Russians are the only ones who are broadcasting it, maybe they are our true allies. So I also think that a fault lies with the mainstream media too, of not covering it more frequently and more objectively, because this caused a problem in perception among a lot of people. And I think this is a big mistake. And I would really hope that stability and investment climate would really improve, and I'm all for deterrence also against Russia, because we don't know what happens after Putin. Maybe he's going to put whoever in charge, so he will be pardoned or he will have a heart attack, whatnot. I mean, who would have thought the Soviet Union collapsed as it did? And this may be the moment again for Russia. Of course, historically speaking, Russia hasn't collapsed that often, but regime change is always possible to some extent or another. I think Georgia should really also focus on this when it comes to the territories, because you need to keep up your prosperity and your reform. This is actually an approach Konrad Adenauer chose too. He called it the magnet theory. He deliberately delayed and postponed, most likely, German reunification by joining NATO, by integrating into the West, and saying, well, our East German brothers and sisters eventually will come back into one state, and it ultimately happened in 1990. So we see that regimes can change, and we are fighting a lot of battles here. We're fighting a lot of windmills, and my organization and I personally too am very committed to the cause of developing that Eastern Partnership and also of developing Georgia and the Georgian interests in this region. It is not actually a geopolitical far-fetched analysis that you say Germany has been very much interested in the past. I mean, the German Empire recognized Georgia first 100 years ago, the Federal Republic did, and also 200 years ago you had German immigrants, so there's a connection there. And that connection just needs to be revived. A lot of times in Central and Western Europe, Georgia is, again, so far away that other issues matter a lot more, especially if you have the idea you're living in a collapsing economic system and you're going to be overrun by half of Africa, then Georgia really isn't that much on top of a lot of people's importance list. So what we try to do is put Georgia back on the table, and we try to provide a framework for dialogue and for actually political influence too. So again, it really depends who you talk to, and we do see the problem that people see, like Russian influence and like people being unwilling to give Georgia a chance in the international community.
Can I pick up on that if I may? No, I want to pick up on what Benjamin is saying, because it got me thinking of something has been coming up repeatedly over this week. It's like, do not make the mistake of thinking that this current moment is eternal. Don't make the mistake of thinking that because the West is going through one of its periods of angst, and those of us that are old enough to remember the 1970s, and I think both of us are, we were probably both teenagers then, we remember the 1970s. We remember that we were losing the Cold War. We remember that the Soviet Union was running rings around us, invading Afghanistan. We remember the humiliation after the Vietnam War. We remember the feeling that our institutions were not working in the wake of the Watergate scandal. We remember the terrorist attacks across Europe and the fear that those inspired. We felt like we were losing and the world was coming apart. And right now I have deja vu. But the good news about that deja vu is I know how that movie ended last time. I remember how that movie ended last time. And I have every reason to believe the movie's going to end the same way again. Likewise, do not make the mistake of thinking that Vladimir Putin is omnipotent. He is not. I mean, I follow domestic Russian politics for a living, and I can tell you that I really do think that Russia is about to enter a very, very, very tumultuous domestic period right now. There is a sense in Moscow that Putinism is entering its lame duck phase. Even though he's about to, I'll go out on a limb and say he's going to win the election in March. I know that's risky, but I'll go out on a limb. But then what happens? Then what happens? And we're already beginning to see the elite at each other's throats as they fight over what the post-Putin world is going to look like. And the post-Putin world can, quite frankly, begin while Putin, the man, is still in the Kremlin. Because I think people are beginning to smell the end. The man can take his shirt off all he wants and ride a horse. He's mortal like the rest of us. And he just turned 65. He's already outlived the average life expectancy for a Russian male. Now, I'm sure he gets better health care than your average Russian male, but nevertheless, the man's mortal. People smell the end. We're going to get to this point, one of these cycles in Russian history, where Russia looks inward and Russia becomes weakened. And the last time that happened was the late 80s and early 90s. And guess what? As a result of that, we were able to provide for the security of the Visegrad Four and the Baltic states. Well, the next time this window opens up, guess who's first in line? The Georgians, the Ukrainians, and if the Moldovans can get a social consensus around it, because rule number one about joining Western institutions is the society has to want to join. Georgia's made that choice, Ukraine's made that choice, the Moldovans are on the fence on that choice. But nevertheless, these three countries are the next ones in line. But like the Baltics and like the Visegrad countries, you have to be ready. And a lot of it is, I mean, we're talking about the Marshall Plan here, but we also have to talk about what these societies can do for themselves in this interim period. So when that window opens, you can walk through that window or through that door or whatever you want to call it. I mean, the Estonians had a joke. If we go in the door and they kick us out, we'll jump in the window. And if they kick us out, we'll come down the chimney. And you know, I mean, you have to be ready to walk through whatever orifice opens up at the time. But that depends on you. That doesn't depend on us. That depends entirely on you.
Well, thank you very much for interesting discussion and points. So my impression is that there is one thing missing in your discourse. This is to my view, the most important role the Marshall Plan played. It was establishment, development of European Union. So Marshall Plan became with the idea of creating payment union and customs union in the areas of these European states which were subject of recovery by the Marshall Plan, and also creation of organization for European economic cooperation was also as one of elements of the Marshall Plan, all this contributed to the ideas which in 1950 already the Minister of Foreign Affairs of France, Robert Schuman, took in his Schuman Plan, and the European community was further created in 1957. I think that the most important thing was that four freedoms, which is now basics of the European integration idea, was exactly coming from the United States' insistence to create this payment union and customs union between the states. Why it was necessary? Because the big portions of the assistance coming from the United States, material assistance, I mean in the goods and also services, they should have been crossing without problems the borders between France, Germany, and other states involved in the Marshal Plan. So I think this was the basic thing. And now about Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, which is absolutely coincides with my views that the next enlargement of European Union will be towards these three states, and Georgia will be lucky if Georgia would be involved in this, because Ukraine and Moldova are naturally, geographically attached to European Union, so they will be considered first if they are ready, and Russia will be doing everything in order that these countries never become ready for this, but they will overcome, to my view. And as regards to the Marshall Plan, how the Marshall Plan can influence these three countries, so it wouldn't be Marshall Plan, but the same kind of ideas to create between these three countries, the cooperation like it was created because of the Marshall Plan in Europe. This is the basic thing for these three countries to go ahead, to prepare themselves for European integration, and to prepare themselves to be attached to European Union, finally to involve. And first step, I think, here will be the involvement of these three countries together as a one regional grouping in the internal market of European Union. And there is need for Marshall Plan that these countries prepare, a type of Marshall Plan, that these three countries prepare among themselves to develop this regional cooperation and also to attach as strongly as possible to European Union. Equally as European Economic Area is more or less, but with less, first in the beginning, with less intensity, of course, because of readiness and preparedness for this, and gradually involving in the European internal market. So that's I wanted just to add to this discussion. Excuse me for intervening, not asking questions, but if you react on these ideas, that I would be happy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for organizing this event and discussing such important developments. My name is Maria Liadze. I'm the participant of the GFSIS National Security and Public Policy course of 2015. And I would be glad to hear both the American and European and also Georgian perspectives on my first question. While we're discussing the importance of supporting the emerging and transitional democracies in the east of Europe, we often forget one of the most important things, that is the legacy of the Soviet Union in the mentality of the post-Soviet countries and their peoples. So whether we like it or not, we live in an environment where the people and the citizens tend to forget or misread their electoral rights, where they choose the candidates according to their sympathies, or that is charismatic or patron-client approaches instead of following the program-based criteria. These citizens also neglect their social rights and responsibilities, and these are still immature and segregated. So how much do you think the mental transformation will have an impact on supporting these democracies in post-Marshall era and in the midst of rethinking the Marshall Plan? And my second question goes to Mr. Carpenter. You spoke about the policies of the Trump administration, and if we draw back to the debates during the first term and the second term of Obama, Obama administration, there were many scholars who argued that American power was destined to decline if we reflect on the ideas of, for example, someone like Fareed Zakaria, who wrote about the post-American world, and various scholars who spoke about the declining power of the United States. How much do you think this has supported the rise of the populism or the rise of the Trump's agenda of America First? Or do you think it was a logical continuation of the so-called self-fulfilling prophecies of the pundits of that time? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting workshop. Kieran Dalton is my name. I'm from the EU Monitoring Mission. And I just really want to comment, let's say, a little bit, because I felt that during the discussions, one might be inclined to say, is the glass half full or is the glass half empty from a Georgian perspective? And I'm thinking in terms of the EU. And I would say it's very much half full, actually, because the point was made, where is the Marshall Plan today, for instance? But I think the EU is working very much in a sophisticated manner. It has a number of different tools in the toolbox. One is around the economy, of course. Another one is the value system that they're spreading, not just here, of course, but in the neighborhood. And then there is the carrot of possible membership. But finally, one that hasn't been mentioned here today is this idea of the common security and defense policy. And Georgia is a beneficiary in this respect. There is an EU monitoring mission here since 2008 with 200 internationals on the ground. And while the mission came here in 2008, and as Brian has mentioned, it was a particular moment. The French had the presidency at that particular moment. So you had a country which was almost matching Russia in that respect. And so Russia dealt with the French, who had the presidency, of course, at that particular moment, and also, of course, were members of the UN Security Council. So I think it was a coincidence that worked in Georgia's favor. Maybe many things didn't work at that particular moment, but I think that was one. And in addition, of course, to the monitoring mission, you also have the EU Special Representative's Office here for the South Caucasus, and you also have the EU delegation. So there are many strings to the bow, I think, from the EU perspective. And I would use the word that was used just earlier on about solidarity. And I think that this presence by the EU in Georgia is very much about solidarity. And it's also very much about consistency. And since I've come here myself, and I'm an Irishman, I can see that the Russian strength has been about consistency. They can wait. But the EU, I think, also gives some of that consistency. We are not somebody that comes at the moment in crisis. We are here now, and I think we are here to help. In terms of hybrid, I just finish on this point. While the subject was not mentioned in 2008, I'm sure, propaganda might have been mentioned, disinformation might have been mentioned, but of course the speed of the tools today make hybrid a word that's now necessary to describe it. And we also feel that from the EU perspective, because one of our functions here, one of the pillars, the 4 pillars that we work under, is to inform EU policy. That's a function we have. And from the EU perspective, because we rely on facts and factual reporting, then we can be a counter-hybrid instrument here in Georgia. And so I think while it wasn't a role that we were given in 2008, it has evolved as being important in terms of the new threats. Thank you.
In terms of the further enlargement of NATO, but also as a corollary of the EU, I think the countries to consider that are next in line, I would say Sweden, Finland, Macedonia, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, but the order, not necessarily in that order, but the first to integrate will be those who have established rule of law. It's that simple. It's not your territories, it's not Russian hybrid, although that affects it, but it's the first of those countries to establish rule of law. Now, Sweden and Finland already have it, so that it's simply up to them whether they choose to apply for membership. They could have it tomorrow if they wanted it. But this is, you talk about sort of the Leninist cultural legacy in Georgia and the other post-Soviet states in this region. It's not so much, I think, a mental hangover from that period. I think it's the institutions of rule of law. And corruption is at the heart of it, but it's not just corruption. It goes beyond that. And so as soon as Georgia is and let's be honest, you can have reformed your military to be as tough and as effective and as efficient as humanly possible. You will never get into NATO until you have genuine rule of law. And you've come a long way. So this is not as criticism, although there is still a ways to go, but this will be the determining criteria in all of these countries. And you look at Moldova, they've probably got the furthest to go of the ones I just mentioned, even though they are contiguous with EU territory and NATO territory. They will not enter until they establish rule of law, and that is their biggest challenge. In terms of the question about the U.S. relative decline in power, of course, the U.S. is in relative decline compared to other countries in the world. I think that's inevitable. But whether this sounds patriotic or not, I still believe that the United States has, in its productivity, in its economic structure, a preeminent global position and will have for decades to come. The only caveat I would add to that is that whoever wins the race to develop usable artificial intelligence will rule the world, and that is simply a fact. No one can dispute that. And so the Chinese have a strategy to be equal in artificial intelligence with the rest of with the United States, who is currently the leader, by 2025, and to be the leader by 2030. Now that's their articulated strategy. Whether they can do that or not is a separate question. But 50 years from now, 60 years from now, this is what will determine who are the great powers in the world, and this alone.
Sorry to interrupt you, but how much it has influenced the agenda of the Trump administration in a pre-electoral period? There was Make America Great Again and America First campaign. How much do you think these debates on declining American power has reinvigorated Trump's electoral campaign?
I don't think the debate about the decline in American power in the world had actually anything to do with Trump's victory. Trump's victory was, in my opinion, based on there's a real fear in middle America that the demographics of America are changing. It is a xenophobic fear of migrants, often of Hispanics, but also of others. It's real. And it is heartfelt, and there are people, primarily white people, males, in middle America who fear that they will no longer be the majority and that the character of the nation is changing. That is one factor. And then the other big factor is, as I mentioned, automation, the fact that a lot of jobs are being lost in the coal industry in middle America to traditional sort of industrial plants are being put out of business because of the way it simply changes in the way the economy functions. And there is tremendous resentment at that fact. And that resentment has been around for a long time. By the way, a lot of those people who feel that they are losing and that nobody in Washington cares about them, who voted for Trump, actually voted for Obama in 2008 as well, because Obama was the complete outside candidate, an African American who had almost no voting history, almost no political record to speak of, but people latched onto him because he offered hope and because they thought that he would finally represent their interests, which to a large extent he did, because he turned around what was the worst economic crisis in American history since the 30s. But it was that same electorate that some of them, minus the xenophobes, who voted for Obama, who then voted for Trump. Trump added to that this xenophobic aspect, which is largely adds to his appeal. I don't think U.S. decline in the world had almost anything to do with that. There was actually a great frustration with U.S. overcommitment, I would say, in the world, and a great fatigue with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which, again, going to the question of whether America is declining, probably the single greatest reason for the decline in American power in the last couple of decades is unfortunately the George W. Bush administration, which in my mind wreaked the greatest national security tragedy on our nation of any in the last 100 years by invading Iraq and precipitating a crisis there that is continuing to claim lives and trillions of dollars.
I wanted to address the issue of the Soviet legacy, the persistence of Homo Sovieticus, because I've been coming to the former Soviet Union since before it was the former Soviet Union. I actually lived in the Soviet Union for the last 3 months of its existence. I remember standing on Red Square in December '91 and looking at the red flag, saying that flag's going to be gone in a couple of days, which it was. And to answer the question, I'll tell you a tale of 4 countries. Ukraine, Russia, Georgia, and Estonia. Because I see Homo Sovieticus almost disappearing almost every place. I was living in both Ukraine and Russia in the summer the summer of '93 and winter of '94. And there was identical political crises going on, and this plays into Mike's point about rule of law. You had identical political crises going on in Russia and Ukraine 2 years after the breakup of the Soviet Union. You had a president and a parliament at loggerheads. In Ukraine, that crisis was solved how? By early elections to both the presidency and the parliament. The president, Leonid Kravchuk, lost and did something amazing. He left office peacefully. That precedent was, I call it the revolution of 1994. The Ukrainians look at me like I'm nuts when I say this, but I really do believe this. The Ukrainian Revolution of 1994 was a quiet revolution. It was the hot as hell summer. It was the most boring election in the history of mankind, but it turned out to be probably the most important election in the post-Soviet period anywhere. And nobody hardly noticed. It was actually spun at the time as a victory for the Russians because Kuchma won, and he was from the East and a Russian speaker and seen as pro-Russian, which to a degree he was. But it didn't matter because the precedent was set. Elections matter. Power is transferred peacefully. The rule of law matters. And every single Ukrainian election since that time has been competitive. This has knock-on effects. This has knock-on effects all over the place in terms of the rule of law, in terms of the development of civil society, and I do not see much Homo Sovieticus in Ukraine now. In fact, I think we in the West can learn quite a bit from Ukrainian civil society. I think we could all learn quite a bit from them. So in Russia, this political crisis was identical. You had a president and a parliament at loggerheads. The crisis, I believe we all know how it was solved, with artillery being lobbed into said parliament. There you didn't have rule of law come into play. There it was quite, the precedent was set quite literally that power flows from the barrel of a gun or a tank or an artillery shell. So I see the persistent, I mean, I don't think we see Homo Sovieticus in the classic sense in Russia today, but you see a descendant of it in Homo Putinicus, or whatever the hell you want to call it, right? Because I don't believe we just have a Putin problem. I do believe we have a Russian problem. His policies are supported, have enjoyed broad support in Russian society. The third country in my tale of four countries is Georgia. When I was living in the former Soviet Union in the early 90s, Georgia was considered, correctly or incorrectly, do not take this the wrong way, do not be offended, but Georgia was considered a no-go zone. It was up there with Chechnya as places you just did not go because it was too dangerous. I never considered visiting Tbilisi in the early 90s, the mid-90s. I began considering it in the late 90s, but was still a little nervous about it, quite frankly, even though I probably shouldn't have been by that time. Now I come here on holiday. What changed? The rule of law came in, regardless of what we think of the former president of Georgia, who's in the news very much right now. The rule of, I mean, you did see enormous advances in the rule of law in the period following the Rose Revolution. And that, quite frankly, changed everything. Georgia went from a place that I was afraid to go to a place where I look forward to going and come on holiday, not just for conferences like this, although I like it when I'm invited to things like this as well. The fourth country, so I mean, it's like, I don't know if there was Homo Sovieticus in Georgia. That I don't see it now, to be honest. I come here and it doesn't feel Soviet. I mean, occasionally you'll see some Soviet architecture and you'll say, God, the new Soviet man sure did have bad taste. But I don't feel any, it feels Georgian to me. It doesn't feel Soviet at all. The fourth country in my tale of four countries is Estonia. I'll never forget the first time I went to Estonia. Because I was in St. Petersburg and I had to get my visa renewed. And I was going to go to Finland to do it. I had to go to a Russian consulate outside of the country. And a friend of mine said, no, go to Estonia, it's cooler. I'm like, Estonia? Really? I want to go to another former Soviet republic. I want to kind of get out and go. I'm like, no, go to Estonia. And I went to Estonia and my jaw dropped because this was 93. This wasn't like now when, okay, yeah, sure, Estonia feels like Sweden now. It felt like Sweden then. I mean, I remember walking around saying, this was part of the Soviet Union? I was literally shocked. This was barely 2 years after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Why? Well, because the Estonians instituted rule of law pretty damn quick. And I'm not sure if Homo Sovieticus existed in Estonia during the Soviet time, to be quite honest, but it certainly didn't exist afterwards. So I think this species has been more or less eradicated except in the place where it was created. And in that place, it has evolved or devolved into kind of something else, but something of the same, maybe if not the same species, the same genus. So that's how I would answer that question. I mean, I think, but it does come down to this rule of law issue.
I'd like to add one more thing, and actually in a little bit broader context, because this has been an issue discussed in Georgia for a while too, especially how to deal with China in the future, because we just had a dinner conversation about where Georgia may go, where investments may come from, and actually Russia wasn't talked about that much, but China was the dominant topic of conversation at that point. And we know the Silk Road is being built right now, and China invests a lot of money in some countries, and the rule of law issue that just came up is very important also for the fact that some countries are just simply not willing to implement that rule of law. And with China, I just want to warn and give some caution, because if you look at African countries in particular who have taken those so-called no-string attached loans from China, they have been experiencing a new type of neo-colonialism. The Chinese bring their own people, they build their own infrastructure, they build the infrastructure that is feasible from the mine to the shipyards, and then taking it over to China in order to produce there. So if Georgia really believes that China may be an alternative in case economic or political developments are slipping back. I would warn of this because it may be a quick and sweet injection of some sugar in terms of no string attached loans, but the Chinese investment comes always with a price tag, and especially African countries have been experiencing this. Another thing I want to talk about is especially the geopolitical working and the dynamics you see. Even in communist times, China and Russia tried to build up rivaling systems of communism. And China and Russia may be some big adversaries again in the future. In southern Russia, parts of Mongolia, heavy Chinese settlements are going to develop again. So this may actually cause a possible long-term conflict between these two countries. And if I were Georgia, I wouldn't want to be in the middle of this. So that should certainly be considered by any means too when you talk about European integration or Eurasian cooperation with China, because if the European Union or the European countries or the United States realize, well, Georgia is orienting itself more and more towards the Far East, why should we even bother about the country on the other side of the Black Sea? So this is definitely a variable for Georgian policymakers to keep in mind as well.
Yes, actually the question about the Homo Sovieticus, and it's an interesting question. I agree with during the previous round of questions, I think it was Michael who said that the Marshall Plan would not be that effective had not Germans done all things that they have done for their own country. So I think that when it comes to the well, the Homo Sovieticus, the society sometimes is divided, to put it in a more schematic way, they are the people that believe that yes, we can do it, and then there are people that need some leader that to come, or the someone to come and pay for it, or to do it, or some Americans should do it. There are certain things that, well, no one else can do but us. I remember in the 90s, very, very prominent people that I truly, well, had respect of. We are just bringing arguments that, well, corruption is deeply embedded in Georgian culture. And then nothing can be done about it. Then they were telling this to our American and European colleagues, and then they were serious about it. I'm not saying that these people were supporting or that they like these corrupt regimes, but they thought that nothing could have been done about it. Well, when it were coming to the police, but these people were saying that, well, this is this, that needs generations and generations, that Moses took people for the 40 years and so on and so on. You can't change police in one day. Yeah, you can. Actually, you can. And then this is I think that, I mean, for me now, in Georgian case, the Homo Sovieticus does not believe in himself. And then there is the new generation. The good thing after the 2012 elections, there are many bad things, but the good thing is that many people moved, and including myself, moved to the academic sector and doing more teaching. I see that the more and more young people, they truly believe that they actually can do it. And then there are so many things that we can do. And I think that this Soviet mentality is, I mean, still strong, but getting, well, so weaker and weaker. And I think that the true liberalism is that when people, on the one first hand, truly believe that this is their responsibility to change something, maybe in the area they are working. And this is the new concept of the leadership. So the good leaders are not that are the alpha males, but that are producing many leaders around them. So I think that that's what matters and what these things. Well, I don't know, Brian probably knows better Russia. My sense with Russia is that, I mean, we truly, sometimes this is the myth that it's been 17 years since Putin in power. And they've been under constant influence of local, the local influence of this, the media. The first thing he's done was he monopolized the media. So imagine the 17 years, it's entire generation. The babies that were born in 1999 now are 17 years old. And then those who were 10 years old now are 27 and so on. The mainstream thinking in Russia it's not about the Russian elite or Kremlin or something, but the problem I think is deeper. The mainstream thinking in Russia is that Putin is a savior. Liberalism was so bad that it was disarray, corruption, the country was falling apart, and it was there were many big problems because of liberals. This is all products of propaganda. Of course, there's nothing else to do with the reality. And then Putin came, and then he just helped us to how they say that waking from their knees or something like this. I mean, just there are some cliches that have become the mainstream thinking, and I think that takes something serious for Russian Adenauer to come up. Yeah, it took something serious for German Adenauer to rise to power. Well, what would be the solution, in my opinion? I think that the best Russia policy would be to support democracies around Russia and to expand NATO and to make it more secure, more prosperous neighborhood. That would generate, I think, rise of Russian Adenauer to power, probably, eventually. Not in my lifetime, but same time. But at least they're going to be the better surrounding. That's, yeah, of course, there are going to be always fights. And this Nord Stream 2 is truly disaster. I completely agree with Michael. But, if you go a little bit back, when Reagan started his offensive, that was that actually caused the Berlin Wall to came, the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was a very similar problem. Urengoy-Uzhgorod, the famous Urengoy-Uzhgorod gas pipeline. And Russia was under sanctions, and then they couldn't build this pipeline, and the Americans were against it, but the Europeans wanted it, and then eventually it was built. And then what Reagan was predicting, that it would be some kind of narcotic for Europe, that happened. But I mean, they are not that easy. I mean, it's not everyone is looking for, and the politics is just very difficult. A couple of days ago, I attended, I mean, it was non-attribution policy, but the story I can tell, that one of serious U.S. prominent diplomats started to quote Kissinger, and then Polish diplomat raised his hand and said that, please stop quoting Kissinger. He's not that popular in Eastern Europe. And there was surprised. And I think that it has, there is the fight always with the short-termists and long-termists. The short-termists call themselves realists, and then, I don't know, long-termists have no specific name. But yeah, well, it's unavoidable, and it's going to continue for long time, and then it's going to be another 3 lifetimes. But I truly believe that they're going to be, we will confront any foe, we will support any friend moment. We're going to be tear down Berlin, tear down this wall moment again, and then we will be witnessing it. The main point again, that's when it comes to the Homo Sovieticus, the less Homo Sovieticus we have in this country, the better is for us. That means that we truly must believe in ourselves, and that we can change and make change truly on the ground. That no Marshal Plan, no NATO, nothing going to help us if we are not helping ourselves.
David, on the possibility of a Russian Adenauer, I mean, I'd settle for I don't know, Russian Theresa May. But I don't think this is going to happen anytime soon. I mean, like, I've been fooled, or not fooled, but I guess I've been proven wrong on numerous occasions when I became optimistic about the possibility of positive change in Russia. I mean, in 2011, my thinking was, and I'm actually on the record and on the air, I'm embarrassed to say saying this, but that I thought at the time that effectively we were seeing kind of Putin becoming a victim of his success. He created prosperity in Russia. This is really, he created it with a big assist from $100 oil prices, but nevertheless, he created it. And what sociology teaches us is that when your material needs are met, you tend to go for higher aspirations. And this is what I thought we were witnessing with Bolotnaya. This is what I really thought we were witnessing. And I thought, okay, this is how it starts. And it didn't start. Guess what, right? Because Krim Nash trumped everything. Krim Nash trumped everything. And then I'm beginning again to see now this generation that's coming of age that has known nobody else but Putin, and they want a new toy. They want a new Xbox, and they've discovered Navalny. And Navalny's very good at marketing himself. I have mixed emotions about Navalny the man, mixed feelings about Navalny the man. I do think the Navalny phenomenon is positive to the extent that he is getting Russians to think of themselves as citizens and not as subjects. But I am going to pause before I again think we're on the cusp of one of these moments. I tend to agree with Gleb Pavlovsky, who says, yeah, sure, this regime will eventually fall. It'll fall in one day and be replaced by something exactly like it. Right, and I would agree with you, David. What we need to be focusing on are the countries that do want to become, liberal democracies. The countries whose societies have made this choice. And I think that we're not going to see positive change in Russia until there is this sense of a catharsis that we just can't be this way anymore. Because the fact of the matter is, Russia doesn't know how to be a state. It only knows how to be an empire. And if you deny it the possibility to be an empire, and that means getting Ukraine and getting Georgia firmly embedded in the Western transatlantic community, then they're going to have to learn how to be a state. They're going to have a catharsis. Because, I mean, my experience in Russia is that even liberal, educated people tend to look down on the people in from the other former Soviet republics as just not being as sophisticated as Russians. If the Ukrainians can do it, and if those wild and crazy Georgians can do it, well, why can't we do it? I think this will create that catharsis, and even if it doesn't, no что, you'll be better off either way. And the Russians will sort out their own problems one way or the other. But I'm not optimistic about a Russian Adenauer anytime soon.
One addition, and this is also very much a difference between Georgia and Russia. If you look at what Georgia did in the past years, especially in terms of crime cooperation, the German Criminal Office and the Georgian Interior Ministry actually have a joint cooperation to fight bandit and mafia crime in Germany. Official numbers actually aim to about 2.5 billion euros of damage caused by the Georgian mafia, and these are verified numbers by the German government. So Georgian authorities and the Georgian government have worked very, very exemplary with German authorities to catch these mafia members and those bandits and retrieve them back to Georgia and persecute them here. And that is actually one of the reasons why Georgia ultimately got the visa-free travel too. So Georgia has done its homework. Such a thing never happened in Russia anywhere. The mafia and crime structures have been increasing ever more since Putin is president, because this is what his regime is really made up of. So Georgians really must congratulate themselves of what they have done, and I think this is really a main difference, and this is something concrete, because often we talk about very lofty concepts, but this is something where Georgia really has succeeded in cooperating and actually achieved a bonus for itself in terms of the visa-free travel. It's not all of the story, but it's definitely a large part of the story. And especially those German parliamentarians who are responsible more for internal and domestic politics really were convinced by such actions over those foreign policy experts who believe that Georgia needs a more geopolitical and more strategic integration into the visa-free Schengen regime.
Thanks again to the speakers. Now probably one last short round and we'll wrap up. Please, Georgi. Yeah.
Well, I will just respond to a couple of points that were raised here. I completely agree that Russia should not be considered its success of its mischief for a number of years. It's not necessarily a sign of Russia's greatness, because it doesn't take to be great to run around with matches and lit fires at your neighbors. It's Marshal Plan that takes greatness, economic greatness and political vision and greatness, which we have seen has brought us the new Europe. But I have to contradict on the issue whether we are experiencing the crisis of political democratic leadership, because this is exactly what I think we have on hands. You mentioned Churchill, whether he would be successful in our times. Well, he was successful in incredibly difficult times back in the 30s, when he was considered a marginal politician for arguing what everyone else didn't want to see. Everyone else was prepared to give in, to appease, etc., etc. They only got him to number 10 after all other options were exhausted. And this is exactly what I think we lack today. Politicians have two options usually, either to follow firm convictions based on certain values and lead others, sometimes into difficult direction, but to lead. And modern politicians, very often, they would rather go polling and discovering what would win them more votes at the next immediate election. I know politicians in Britain who do only this. They research the marginal seats, swing states for America, and would focus specifically on the issues that would kind of give them more votes, regardless what they want. So following the crowd, I mean, yes, democracy is supposed to reflect the needs and interests of the people, but, well, I don't want to sound elitist, but majority is very often wrong. And it can be manipulated, as we have all seen now, even in the most advanced countries and nations, in the countries where people have the longest experience of voting in UK, in the country with the greatest democracy in the United States. So I think this is probably an issue that needs to be considered. I do not have a recipe how to create a new Churchills, a new Adenauers, a new Thatchers, but all of these great leaders actually did what was not popular, which was very hard. And now politicians are weary of actually advocating something that is difficult.
Thank you. I am George Jadishvili. I'm Associate Professor in International Black Sea University, Tbilisi. So I also want to dwell on some some cautionary tale. The very term Marshal Plan was in the air about 25, 27 years ago with regard precisely to Russia. So the Yeltsin's time, kind of this brief honeymoon, and we all remember all the effusive praises which were just put upon Russia, which was sort of reforming itself, and it was the obvious lack of attached strings in that regard, because probably kind of the West and the United States wanted Russia to be new and novel and democratic so much that it turned a blind eye to some other pronouncements of other politicians, because Yeltsin was saying that let all the republics and autonomies take as much independence as they want, and then someone like Rudskoy or Hasbulatov was saying, sami pripazul, they will creep back themselves, referring to post-Soviet republics. And also United States, because Russia was important partner, was turning blind eye on the new imperial streaks of Russian policy, which Georgians felt actually firsthand in Abkhazia and South Ossetia when Russia was stoking the separatist conflict. So in this particular regard, I guess when this new large package of help will be introduced towards the countries of Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, so these this story should also be in mind. Even though, yes, the countries, our countries, are very much ahead in terms of their mentality, maybe I'll have some reservations in Moldova, because otherwise they wouldn't put both the current president in power. And they have like other massive problems. But I think this should be remembered. And second, like, continue to Georgi's point about politicians, which are like artificially manipulating democracy. Unfortunately, societies are also have become complacent. Yes, Sears catalog, it's wonderful, but it is the consequence of the democratic move and liberal economy which produces, but it shouldn't be the end in itself. We see, like in the societies, just like the second part of the Fukuyama's book about actually the last man. The last man is a consumer who is like concerned about largely nothing but, okay, new iPhone, for instance. So I think that some attention like should be paid to people in the West, to the society in the West, actually holding back values first, rather than, well, in between iPhones, in between Sears catalogs. Thank you.
Well, if any of our speakers have some final comments.
So I just want to address your question, because I agree with you. I think there was a lot of naivete about Russia in the early 1990s. I think what we faced was, even before the Soviet Union had collapsed, all the main institutions of the Russian state had been captured essentially by the KGB. And so any effort at liberalization was effectively doomed from the start, in my humble opinion. But what I disagree with rather vehemently about the premise of your comment is that it's the same thing that I hear every time I speak to someone from the Middle East. The United States is responsible for everything that's bad that happens in the United States. The United States is responsible for the failure of Russian democracy to thrive in the 1990s. Look, I agree with Dato. You all have to take responsibility for what happens in Georgia. You're not going to get a Marshall Plan. Russia didn't get a Marshall Plan in the 1990s, but that doesn't mean that the United States is to blame for what happened in Russia. It was its own trajectory. But that's often implied that, you know, we mistook, we were naive. Yes, some were naive. Jeff Sachs, I think, was naive. But I don't know, going back, that had I been in a position of power where I could have waved a magic wand and, you know, assigned this or that to happen in Russia, I don't know that things would have turned out any differently. I think the state was captured. You know, we could have ended up with Rudskoy as president. I mean, you know, counterfactuals can lead down a million blind alleys. So I'm not even going to go there. But that's my only comment.
Yeah, no, I'll respond to that and turn it on its head in a sense, because we're often accused in the West of somehow humiliating Russia at the end of the Cold War. I mean, this is conventional wisdom in Moscow, and it's a narrative that is picked up by a lot of otherwise smart people in Washington and Brussels that say, well, if only we had been nicer to the Russians, if only we had not humiliated them so much. Now, maybe I was living in a parallel universe, and this is all part of an experiment in quantum mechanics, but I thought we were pretty magnanimous after the Cold War. I mean, if you think about it, Russia inherited the Soviet seat on the UN Security Council, right? Is there any, like, divine right they had to that seat? The Soviet Union comprised 15 republics. Why did Russia automatically get that seat? Well, it got it because largely the West acquiesced, right? Russia not only kept its own nuclear weapons, but it got Ukraine's, Kazakhstan's, Belarus's. I was in Kyiv when the Budapest Declaration was signed. If anybody was humiliated, it was the Ukrainians, because that was not popular in Kyiv at the time. In fact, I never saw more people angry with the United States in Ukraine than I did on that day. We continued to have superpower, so-called superpower summits with Boris Yeltsin, even though the Russian Federation was in no way, shape, or form throughout the 1990s a superpower. I remember going to Helsinki when we felt we needed to get Yeltsin's permission to enlarge NATO to include 3 sovereign states, the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary, none of which are continuous to Russia or anywhere near its borders. If this is humiliation, shit, humiliate me this way, I'll take it any day. So I think, I mean, I do agree with you that we were too indulgent there. And there, as Mike said, counterfactuals, you can play with them all the while. I don't know how things would have turned out had we not been, but I do think we were too indulgent. But the argument, I hear more often the other argument, that we humiliated the Russians at the end of the Cold War. You're not making that argument, but yours is the mirror image, polar opposite of that argument that you will hear, not just in Moscow, but unfortunately you will hear it in Washington, in Brussels, in Berlin as well, in London. It's an argument that's been picked up on by not just the Stephen Cohens of this world, but by many people who are Putin understanders and Putin apologists, or people who are just misinformed about what actually went on at the end of the Cold War. So that's all I'd say about that.
Couple of points on opportunities. So I think that this Western help, but especially U.S., the U.S. assistance never has been designed to actually give you the recipes, in my experience. It was designed to create an opportunity. And then these opportunities were created for many countries after fall of the Soviet Union. This is up to nation how well they are using these opportunities. I don't think that some other former Soviet Union countries have less opportunities. I mean, it's how effectively you are using these opportunities that it's all about. And then I'm going back to my point and the point you made about the Germans using these opportunities created by the Marshal Plan. It's all about believing in yourself and doing the things that no one can do for you. And well, on Russian point, I think that I do not expect, by the way, it's not only UNC they inherited all wealth that has been accumulated in the Soviet Union. It was so-called the zero system, and then it was kind of endorsed. But I mean, okay, this is in the past. But I don't think that West did anything bad to Russia and then all those things. I mean, I think even the opposite, that there were certain mistakes made, mistakes that they've been given too many things have been done that were not necessary to do, and they just reinforced the Russian narrative that, yeah, well, they owe us something. That didn't play a good role in the recent history. So that's...
Well, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the speakers for the excellent presentations. And thank you for active participation, and we look forward to see you on one of our future events. Thank you.